So good question. Okay, good evening, everyone. Gloria, Paul, Arthur, Oliver, and Erwin on the phone there. I'm sure everyone else who's not with us is just still inebriated from their Purim Sudas, but maybe you guys are inebriated, still manage to log on anyway. So Shkoach, even though Purim has just come to an end, we are basically just sitting safe right now. Shkoach for keeping to our regular regimen of learning. So good to see you all. Now, what we're going to be learning about today is called a Mitzorah. And Gloria, as we were talking about before I hit the recording, what is this Mitzorah? So Mitzorah is, for lack of a better term, it's a form of leprosy that one could be afflicted with.
Oh,
and now it's not just like any medical issue that one can get. We talk about how in Chazal, they say perhaps the reason that one's afflicted with it is they spoke Lashon Hara. And so tsaras can be found on a person, but it can be found in other places as well. There's a case of a Bayis Hamanuga, where your house is afflicted with tsaras. Now it says in the Gemara Sanhedrin that it's l'drosh l'kavel schar. Such a thing never happened, but it's on the books. In theory, it could. And so we're going to talk about is two kinds of mitzoras. A mitzorah is someone who is afflicted with tsaras. So good to remember that word. So a mitzorah, let me give you a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to throw some info at you. The Masifta actually has a very nice introduction I'm going to rip off here because they frankly could do a better job than I can, so why reinvent the wheel? So a few things to know. When someone becomes a mitzorah, you don't just become a mitzorah, actually. This is very unique. This is similar to Kiddush HaChodesh, where even if there's a new moon, Beis Din has to actually declare it Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month, for it to be the beginning of the month. Similar idea over here. I could be afflicted with tsaras, but until the Kohen comes, askins and says, you have tsaras, and diagnoses you, you actually, from a halakhic standpoint, do not have tsaras, according to that. Now, what happens when someone gets tsaras? So what happens is they leave the machane. So back when the Jews were in the wilderness, that meant leaving, outside the encampment. But what it means in modern day Israel would be, let's say it was in Yerushalayim, for instance. It could take place in theory in any walled city that, like we discussed. The machane hashchina, where the divine presence is the Beis HaMikdash. The Machane Leviyah, the encampment of the Leviim, is Har Habayis, the Temple Mount, and the entire city of Yerushalayim is considered the Machane Yisrael, the encampment of the general Jewish people. And a Mitzorah, in theory, would have to leave Yerushalayim during those days. He's meant to go briefly into exile to atone for his sin. Now, a little bit about what the ramifications of being Mitzorah are, is that it becomes an Av Hatuma, which we discussed last time. That means you're basically an origin of Tuma. You're like a patient number one here. And so that means is that you could render other human beings, or you could render also garments, and it goes without saying food and other items as well. You could render basically anything Tameh. Now there's something unique to Mitzorah. Most things that become Tameh is because you touch them or other kind of ways. But a Mitzorah, just by virtue of him entering into a home, a form of what we call Biyah, he renders everything in the home also Tameh as well. That's something important to remember in the Gemara. Just remember to mute ourselves. There's some background noise coming from somewhere. So just mute ourselves for a moment. Shvech. Now, we're going to talk about the Mishnah in a moment, is that the Mitzorah, there's two kinds of Mitzorahs. There's a Mitzorah that is called Muchlat, which means, like this is a modern Hebrew, you see this word also, Behechlet. It means certain. We know the Kohen says, I see clearly you are a Mitzorah, and basically he has to go out of the city until he heals from his tsaras. Okay, I'm just going to have to mute. I don't know where all the noise is coming from, so I'm just going to mute everyone. You can feel free to unmute if you have a question now. Okay. As we were saying, so there's a Mitzorah that also is called Mitzorah Muskar, which is he's put under quarantine. He leaves. We're not sure in think about it, like, we're just dealing with COVID. So when we're not sure if someone had COVID, sometimes we put them in quarantine. So Mitzorah is a muskar, he goes into quarantine, and the Kohen comes after 7 days and sees what his status is. So there's a number of other things that have to be done, but actually our Mishnah will begin to elaborate on that. So just before we go further, do we have a general sense of what a Mitzorah is? Is there anything just in terms of the general definition that I can do to clarify before we jump into the Gemara? Gloria, I remember you had a question at the beginning about a Mitzorah. So did we address your question, or is there perhaps more we can do to clarify? We're good? Okay. All right, because I muted everyone, so you're allowed to unmute, though. I just wasn't sure where the noise was coming from, so I did a blanket mute on everyone. Okay. Here we go. We are on the Mishnah Ches Amud Beis. It's the first Mishnah on the page. It's in the white lines. You should easily be able to find the Mishnah. So, Ein Bei Mitzorah Muskar LeMitzorah Muchla. Once again, we're in the Ein Bei Mishnayos. Nothing to do with Megillah at the moment, but don't worry. At the end of today, we will return back to Purim. As if we didn't have enough of Purim. It is Shushan Purim, by the way. My parents are in Yerushalayim. We'll be hearing, or I guess at this point have heard Megillah tonight, and will tomorrow, because Yerushalayim was a walled city from the times of Yeshua. But anyway, we're doing the Ein Bei Mishnayos, not directly relevant. Ein Bei Mitzorah Muskal Mitzorah Muchlat Priya Ufrima. In most respects, a Mitzorah who is a Muchlat, who is certainly a certain Mitzorah, versus a Mitzorah who is Muskar under quarantine, they share the same laws, the same parameters of what they need to do. The only distinction between them that the Mishnah wants to highlight is Priya Ufrima. Priya is you kind of let your hair grow, and perhaps you're wrapping your head like an Avel would. And Frima is rending of the garments. So that is only for a Mitzorah Muchlat, a Vadai, a certain Mitzorah. Ein Bei Tar Mitoch Hester L'Tar Mitoch Hechlit Ela Tiglachas Utzi Parim. And in regards to the purification process, you don't become a Mitzorah for life. So the difference between a Mitzorah who's Muskar under quarantine versus one who is Muchlat is that one who was only certainly a Mitzorah has to do these extra processes of shaving oneself and bringing these bird offerings at the conclusion of his Mitzorah period. That is what the Mishnah teaches us. Now, the Gemara, as it's been doing until now, makes a basic inference. So if the Mishnah told us that the only difference between a Mitzorah Muchlat and a Mitzorah Muskar are the items we mentioned, the Priya Frima and the Tiglachas and Tziparim, so that we can infer that in regards to being exiled, leaving the neighborhood, the encampment, as well as the laws of Tumah, of producing Tumah, they share the same parameters in general. Okay, very good. Now, Minahani Mili, how do I know to distinguish between a Mitzorah Muskar and a Mitzorah that's Muchlat? Because you look in the Torah, there's a little bit of ambiguity as to how to distinguish between them. The Tani Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Kamei Rav Huna, the Tiaru HaKohen Mispaches Hi V'Chives Gadav. Let me just check the pasuk. We're quoting. It's the third pasuk quoted here on the page. So if you look there, it says, right, so the implication of the word vitaher is tahor mi priya ufrima demei kara. You look in the Girsa here, it says mei kara. The implication is that there's a kind of Mitzorah out there who never had to do Frima, Priya Ufrima, who never had to, whatever that process is of letting his hair out or wrapping it like an Avel. And in terms of rending the garments, the implication is that a Mitzorah Muskar was never required to do it, whereas Mitzora Muchlat was required to do it. I just want to make sure I'm going to be using these terms on Mitzora Muchlat versus Mitzora Muskar. Can I retranslate those terms? Anyone need to take notes down? Write this down if you need to. Mitzora Muchlat is someone who's certainly a Mitzora. Mitzora Muskar is a quarantine Mitzora. We don't know if he's a Mitzora. So just keep that in mind. Amar le Rava, so remember last week we talked about a zav, this odd form of sort of like a seminal emission that a man has that makes him tameh. It uses a similar formulation there, also a vitaher. But if we assume that the word vitaher means that he was pure, he was spiritually pure beforehand, it just doesn't, like, how do I read that into zav? What's he not tameh from? So therefore, Rava says, how do we understand the word v'taher? Ela tahor hashtam l'tameh kli cheres beheset abal gav v'hadar chazi lo metame lemafreya. What's it telling us? So remember, a zav has to wait shiva nekiyim. He has to wait 7 clean days in order to become spiritually pure once again. So the halacha is that in theory, if it's day number 7, he goes to the mikvah already, but then after going to the mikvah, he then sees an emission once again, which is so sad. It ruined, he's about to hit the finish line, and then right at the end of 7 days, he has to count it all over again. So the question is, he was walking around the past few hours, all jolly, acting like he was done with the process. He already went to the mikvah. So the question is, if he moved something around, beheset, he would not retroactively render it tameh. That's what the pasuk comes to tell us. That retroactively, he's not going to render something tameh if he becomes tameh again after going to the mikvah, beheset. And therefore, hachinami, so too over here, in the case of a mitzora, hachinami tahor hashtam l'tameh b'bilam afrei. Remember, we talked about how a mitzora enters a house and then he renders things tameh by entering the house. So similar idea over here. If he thought he was off scot-free, and then it turns out that, oh no, what do you know? He's actually tameh. So then he would not render all those things tameh lemafreya, retroactively. So, okay, great. That was Rava's question. So Rava has to offer a different solution. Where do I see in the Torah that I can distinguish between a Mitzora Muskar and a Mitzora Muchlat, that only a Mitzora Muchlat has to worry about Priya Ufrima, about these additional strictures? So Rava mehacha. That's Sarua Shirbo Nega Hanega, the Mitzora who is afflicted with an affliction. Misha Tzaraso Tluya Bagufo, who has to do Priya Ufrima, a Mitzora whose tsaras is contingent on his body. What does this mean? A Mitzora Muchlat, someone who is certainly, we know for sure he's a Mitzora. The only way for him to stop being a Mitzora, to end that period, is for him to actually heal from the tsaras. Whereas a Muchlat, one who is only in quarantine, if we see there hasn't been any change afterwards, then he can leave his quarantine. So the word bo implies that someone bo in his body, that his saraz is fully contingent on the changes in his body, whether his body heals. He's someone who has to do priya ufrima, who has to use additional strictures regarding his hair, regarding his garments, but not someone who's only besuffic, someone who's only in quarantine. Amrli Abaye, Elmiata, but Abaye, of course, challenges Rava. Elmiata, Kol Yemei, Asher Hanegavo Yitma, Misha Tsaraso, Tluya Begufo, who the Tod Shiluach, Usha Ain Tsaraso Tluya Begufo, Ain Ta'un Shiluach. But according to this logic, I could ask the following question. It says in the pasuk regarding the law of leaving the encampment. Remember, we learned that any kind of Mitzorah has to leave the encampment. But wait a minute, if you say the word bo implies only one whose saras is healing from his saras is contingent on the healing of his physical body, then according to this, only someone who's saras, only a Mitzorah Mukhlat should have to leave the encampment. Why does Mitzorah Muskar have to leave the encampment? According to this form of interpretation. If you want to say, you know what? Ain't hachinami. All Mitzoras have to leave the encampment. But this would contradict our Mishnah. Ain't Mitzorah Muskar Mitzorah Mukhlat. Priya Frima. But our Mishnah should have said, in addition to Priya Frima, that's the distinction. So where do we know that even a Mitzorah Muskar has to go into leave the encampment? How do we know that he's exiled from the encampment during his quarantine? It would seem from the pasuk only one who's contingent on his body needs to leave. Mitzorah Mukhlat. So the answer is Amar Le Yemei, but Kol Yemei L'Rabos Mitzorah Muskar L'Shuach. The fact that pasuk said didn't just suffice with saying Yemei, the days of, but Kol Yemei, all the days of. The word Kol is seemingly superfluous, so it comes to include the Mitzorah Muskar as well, that he too must leave the encampment. So what we see from here is that a Mitzorah Muskar does not have to worry about Priya Frima, about those extra strictures regarding his head and garment, because the stricture is only for someone who has bo, who is the Tsaras contingent on the healing of his body. Why does the Mitzorah Muskar why does Mitzorah Muskar not have to leave the encampment then? Why does he have to leave the encampment then? Shouldn't he also be exempted from that because it says bo? So the answer is yes, that's true, but it says kol in the pasuk in order to tell us that he also leaves the encampment. I think the if I'm not mistaken, I have to check that. I think it's a Turei Evan raised the question, which is shkoyach. Two negatives equal a positive. So why not just the Torah not write the word bo and not write the word kol? It's only because it wrote the word bo that we need the word kol to include Mitzorah Muskar. So just don't write the word bo, and then I wouldn't need the word kol. And then we save on two words. So that's a question he brings up. One last thing, we'll get to the Mishnah, and then we'll pause for any questions. We'll take out the words ihachi. There's a bit of a discussion in the Girsa, but just to make life a little bit easier for us, we're going to assume that this next part of the Gemara until the Mishnah is a separate question. Until now, we were talking about the Reisha, the beginning of the Mishnah, which was distinguishing between what a Mitzorah Muskar Mukhla do when they're a Mitzorah, but then the Seifa distinguishes between what they do at the end of their Mitzorah period. And we said only a Mitzorah Mukhlat is expected to do a shaving as well as bringing these bird offerings. So here we go. Tiglachas utziparem, my time low. Diktani ain bein tahar mitoch hesker l'tar mitoch hechlet el tiglachas tzipar. So the question is, why isn't our Mishnah that only a Mitzorah Mukhlat is expected to do these extra items at the end of his Mitzorah period? Amar Abaye, Amar Kra, v'yatzakwen el michutz lamachaneh, meaning nirba negat tzaras. So it says, and he will heal from his negat tzaras. Mi shetzaras l'tliya b'refuos, yatza zeh she'ein tzaras l'tliya b'refuos el b'yamim. So the fact that it says when he will heal from his tzaras, only someone who is diagnosed with certainty, who's a mukhlat with tzaras, needs to actually show physical healing. So that's what the pasuk is talking about. Who needs to bring that offering and needs to shave his hair? But whereas someone who's a muskar, he doesn't have to heal physically from his tzaras, so it's not talking about him in the pasuk. Therefore, the psukim there that are talking about the bringing the tziporim as well as the shaving does not apply to one who is only in quarantine, to a Mitzorah Muskar. I know you see these Ein Bein Mishnahs, each Mishnah is just like its own self-contained little sugya of something new that we're learning. So let me just pause. Is there's a little bit back and forth over there. There was some new concepts that we raised along the way. So I just want to pause for a moment. If there's anything I could do to help summarize or clarify anything that came up along the way. I admit that was a little bit of a slightly difficult back and forth to follow, perhaps. Okay. You still hear me, guys, right? Okay, good. I see you nodding, Paul. It's always good. I always need to check. Thankfully, the internet's working. Okay, this next one might be a little bit more relatable. Now we're going to talk about stam. Look at the next Mishnah, you see exactly what I mean. Let me ask you a question. Does the Torah only need to be written in Hebrew, or it could be written in any language? Does a mezuzah need to be written in dafka in Hebrew, or it could be written in any language? Or tefillin? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's what this is going to deal with. Ein being svarim l'tefillin mezuzos. There's no difference between writing svarim from Tanakh, like a Sefer Torah, versus writing tefillin and mezuzos. Elishat svarim nichtavin b'chol lashon. The only distinction between how they have to be constructed and written is that Tanakh can be written in, we'll just translate now as any language, utfilin and mezuzos and nechtavos el ashuros. Whereas tefillin and mezuzos need to be written in Hebrew. Just a very quick background. There's something called Ksav Ivri and Ksav Ashuri. The Gemara, forgetting where precisely, but the Gemara deals with what came first, what the order is, but I believe academically, the Hebrew lettering that we use today is not the original lettering that they used back in ancient biblical and pre-biblical time. This is what we use called Ksav Ashuri, it's Ashuris, but Ksav Ivri was actually the earlier one. Nonetheless, we've come to accept Ksav Ashuri. It's a good sugya, a good topic to look into for another time. But just when you see Ashuris in this context, it means Lashon HaKodesh, referring to standard Hebrew. So Tefillah mezuzos need to be in Hebrew. Tanakh can be written in any language. That's the first opinion of Tana Kama. The second opinion of Rav Shimon Gamliel Omer, Af Bisfarim Lo Tirshu to Eliavanis. Sifrei Torah, Sifrei Tanakh, they can only be written in Hebrew. But with the exception, the only language they're allowed to be translated into is Greek. Now that's really weird. Why specifically Greek? Why not like Spanish or Chinese? I mean, obviously, I don't think the rabbis in the Talmud had exposure to Chinese or to all these other kinds of languages around the world. But what's so special about Greek language? We'll talk about that later. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. We're going to make our base. Oh yeah, Paul, please unmute yourself and happy to take your question. Paul, were you trying to?
Yeah. Can I ask a question? Is there any connection between these items and the Tuma discussion beforehand? I mean, are these items that cannot obtain Tuma status?
Very good. So
or is it just totally a separate thought?
Yeah. I like what you're saying here. You see, there's like a temptation to kind of just view all these as miscellaneous Mishnayos. To a certain degree, they are miscellaneous, but maybe there's a method to the madness about why one comes after the other. For instance, what was it, on Sinai Bays? We said there's no difference between Yom Tov and Shabbos. And the following Mishnah was there's no difference between Shabbos and Yom HaKippurim. So that's a very natural transition. Next one we went to was Nidarim and Nidava. Taking a Neder. And then Neder was juxtaposed with the Mishnah about Nidarim versus Nidavos. So there you have a natural connection as well between those two. Then Zav and Mitzorah, even in the Gemara, you saw that they get compared and contrasted with each other. So what's the connection of Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzos to Stam, to what we just learned? Perhaps nothing directly, but the line we're about to see in the Gemara, as you're pointing out, maybe that's the connection. From Megidin, Zev is Zesham. The connection is Toma Tahara. So even though there's a little bit of a dispute here about what language a Sefer Torah can be written in, whereas Tefillin and Mezuzos clearly have to be in Hebrew, nonetheless, the laws of how they are constructed in terms of sewing them with the sinews, which, by the way, we saw some machlokas and mak, was not so clear if dafka has to be with gidin, but here it takes that for granted. And in regards to the metames yadayim, we learned this a few shiurim ago. Was on Zion Amid Aleph we talked about this. That counterintuitively, a sefer, once something is considered a holy book, because Chazal didn't want you to mistreat it and to have have it near food, so then the mice will come and eat it. So they said that it exudes tumah. So perhaps the mentioning of tumah here, Paul, like you're pointing out, might be the tenuous connection to the previous Mishnah. I like that idea. I like that. Okay. Now let's get to the meat and potatoes. We said, according to the Tanna Kama, the main opinion of the Mishnah, that a Sefer Torah can be written in any language. We're minhu. However, we have a brisa here which is going to contradict this. Mikra shekasu targum, utargum shekasu mikra. If you have something that's in Hebrew, but then you write it in Aramaic, utargum shekasu mikra, or you have an Aramaic word in Tanakh and you write it instead in Hebrew, uksav ivri, or if you write it in ksav ivri, remember we talked about it instead of ksav ashuri. It will not be considered a holy book, a sacred book, until you write it in the proper language, in the proper format, on a sefer with ink. Okay, so what's the contradiction? The contradiction is that the contradiction that we have is that the Mishnah said that you could write sefer in any language that you want. Here, it seems much stricter. It sounds like there's no wiggle room. Now, just to explain, it's easy to think of. Majority of the Torah is written in Hebrew. So to write anything, almost anything in the Torah in Aramaic is a departure from the Hebrew. There are a few words and phrases in the Torah which actually, believe it or not, are in Aramaic. I believe Yaakov, when he's talking with Lavan, Yagar Sahadusa is the name of the place. And so that actually is Aramaic. And when you look actually toward the end of the Torah, I think in Hazinu and Zosa Bracha, there's some words that appear there that also seem to be Aramaic in nature. So to change it from Aramaic to Hebrew would be a problem as well. So I don't get it. Am I allowed to write a sefer Torah in any language, or am I not allowed to depart from the original language of the Torah? How do I reconcile this Mishnah and Brisa? Now, of course, we could say that they are at odds with each other, but we would only like to do that as a last resort. I don't think it's going to come. Well, I don't think. I read through the Gemara. Amar Rava. So we're going to give up to 4 resolutions. The first 3 resolutions will be shot down, and we'll conclude with the 4th resolution. Amar Rava, lo kasha, kam begufan shalanu, kam begufan shalehen. What's the distinction? Our Mishnah is talking about even if you depart from the original language, you're still writing it in the standard Hebrew with the standard Hebrew letters. Whereas in the Brisa, what's the issue? That you're departing from the proper letters that are supposed to be used. Amar Le'abai, it sounds like a nice distinction in principle, but the Brisa doesn't seem to be exclusively talking about a distinction in the calligraphy. But Mayu Kimta, Lahiba Gufan Shalahen. How are you going to read the Brisa when it says Mikra Shekasu Targum, Utargum Shekasu Mikra? The Brisa is taking issue with writing it in a different language. But according to you, you're reading the Brisa. If you Mikra Shekasu Mikra, Targum Shekasu Targum, Nami, Tani Achich Livana Shur Sal Saving Dio. So according to your reading here, Rava, why do I have to even start talking about Hebrew written in Aramaic, Aramaic written in Hebrew instead? If it's all about the difference in calligraphy and the difference in lettering, even if I write the Hebrew but with a different calligraphy or the Aramaic with different calligraphy, that should also be a problem. So that's not a fair. It's a good distinction in the abstract, but that doesn't seem to be what the Bryce is talking about. Hello, Kasha. So the Gemara offers another resolution. Harabanan Harashim Gamliel. The Tanakh in our Mishnah, of course, is the Rabbanan, and the Brisa follows the second opinion of Mishnah Rashim ben Gamliel, that the opinion of Rashim ben Gamliel is that you cannot write a Sefer Torah in any language. But even Rashim ben Gamliel says that you're allowed to write a Sefer Torah in Greek. The Brisa makes an absolute statement that you cannot depart from the language at all. It doesn't make any doesn't take into account writing in Yavanis, writing in Greek. Elo kasha, kan bisfarim, kan bitfilin umezuzos. Tefillin mezuzos my taima, shemiksebehu, v'hayu, v'hav yasan hiyu. So maybe our Mishnah, of course, at the beginning it says it, is talking about Sfarim and Tanakh, talking about a Sefer Torah. Whereas the Brisa, why is the Brisa so particular about having it in the original language? For Tefillin and Mezuzos have to be in the original language. But it's not talking about Sifrei Torah. So it's not odds with the Mishnah, which says that you can write the Torah in any language. It's talking about specifically Mezuzah and Tefillin, which says V'hayu, which implies it should be in the original language. However, while again, that's a nice distinction, it just doesn't fit into the wording of the Brisa. My Targum, Shekasu Mikra, Ika. So, but then how do you make sense of the words translating from Aramaic into Hebrew? It says in the Brisa, one's not allowed to translate from Aramaic to Hebrew. Torah, I understand for the Torah, that would be usher. Why? Because Torah has the words Yigar Sahadusa. It has Aramaic. There's Aramaic in the Torah. But Elahacha, my Targumika. But Tefillin Mezuzos, they only have snippets from the Torah. And if you look through what's written in Tefillin Mezuzos, there's nothing in Aramaic there. So if the Brisa is telling me I cannot write Tefillin and Mezuzos in another language, should only say you should not write Hebrew in Aramaic. It shouldn't say you should write Aramaic in Hebrew, because if it's only talking about Tefillin Mezuzos, that case of Aramaic to Hebrew just doesn't exist. So finally, we have our final resolution. Lo kasha, how do we reconcile it? Kan b'Megillah, we get to tie it back into Purim. Kan b'Megillah, kan b'Sfarim. The Mishnah is talking about general Sifrei Torah, general Tanakh. But whereas the Brisa, which is particular about having it written in Hebrew, is the Megillah, and Aramaic not being translated into Hebrew. Megillah my taima. Well, why should the Megillah have stricter parameters than other Sfarim? Because it says in there that should be written, and it should be in the original lashon. We see that from the words in the Megillah, that there's a mandate to retain the original language. So the question is, my Targum Shekasu, Mikra Ika. So then, where do we see Megillah is written in Hebrew. So I understand when the Brisa says don't change from Hebrew to Aramaic. But where do I see in the Megillah, Aramaic, I shouldn't be changing to Hebrew? It's the same issue we have with Mezuzah and Tefillin. Samara Papa. V'nishma piskam hamelech. One suggestion is the word piskam is Aramaic for the Hebrew word divar. So a piskam is a saying. That is Aramaic. So there are Aramaic words. Likewise, or not the Cholanashim Yitnu Yikar leBaalehen. Yikar here is Aramaic for the word kavod, for giving honor. So there actually are words, and we're going to talk about this in future shiurim later as we go through Megillah here, that there are other words that we didn't necessarily even know the interpretation for, the translation for. And so there is Aramaic actually in the Megillah. So what's the final answer here? The final answer that we have that we'll conclude with is that the Mishnah that says that you can write in any language is referring to general Sfarim and Tanakh, whereas Megillah, the Brisa, which has stricter parameters, says do not deviate from the original language. that's referring to Megillah. And if you were paying attention during Megillah reading, then we may have noticed that some of the words weren't written in Hebrew, but they're written in Aramaic. So we're not allowed to change from Aramaic to Hebrew, and we're not allowed to change from Hebrew to Aramaic. And thus, we tie everything back into Hilchos Purim. We have come full circle. And okay, that's what we got. I prepared the shiur today, so I didn't exactly have as much time to do additional unit. There's interesting Tosos here on Testament Aleph on the top, where he talks about how maybe basically the question is that it seems implied from the Gemara in Gittin on Samach Amid Aleph that a Sefer Torah Shechasing Uriah Achas is problematic, but however, Dafka Uriah Achas al Pasuk Echalon, the implication in the Gemara is that if there's even a pasuk that is missing from the Torah, it would not invalidate it. So if a whole pasuk could be missing, what's the big deal? Certainly, changing from Aramaic to Hebrew shouldn't be any worse. So Tosfos says, and perhaps they don't like this one, that changing the language is worse than omitting some of the language. Okay, they don't fully accept it themselves. The other answer they give is that maybe it doesn't invalidate the Torah, but you just should amend it to make sure that it conforms with the original language. Okay, shkoyach, that brings us to the end of our shiur for tonight. Again, thank you all for making the time. Hope you all had a freilich and Purim. Now wishing you all freilich and Shushan Purim. Remember, no Tachanun or Lam Natseach tomorrow morning. All right, take care, everyone. Have a wonderful Shabbos.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Take care.
you.